I'm going to demonstrate how knowledge is superior to faith by answering this Christian's 3 questions about the Bible.
We're off to a really great start already when the creator of the video wants to educate us on the Bible, doesn't really know the biblical definition of faith. See this video on that topic.
There are some very important reasons why we have to date the Gospels after 70 CE.
Okay, so before we even get into his reasons why, notice he uses the word have to date the Gospels post 70 AD. If I'm taking his words too literally here, he can correct me, but it sounds like what he's saying is that the things that he's going to tell us about necessitate a post 70 AD dating, meaning the data that he's going to point to make a pre 70 AD dating unintelligible. That is a steep claim, and I'm very excited to see what he's got.
One reason is because it mentions the destruction of the temple, and that didn't happen until 70 CE.
Okay, so he's right that there's mention of the destruction of the temple, and he's right about the dating of the destruction of the temple. I already know where he's going with this, but let's hear him out.
So the Gospels want you to believe that a prophet predicted the future, but there's no evidence that these letters or Gospels were written in the 1st century at all.
He hasn't finished his argument yet, but I find this really ironic because he constantly sputters the phrase, no evidence. But meanwhile, he's not just like a Jesus mythicist, the type of person that a lot of academics will laugh about, but he's the type of mythicist that mythicists will laugh at. He thinks the Romans created Jesus. There's no evidence for that theory. Nonetheless, I think we have plenty of evidence for 1st century dating of the Gospels. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a 30-minute video, so here's just one consideration. Scholars generally date the book of Acts between 62 and 90 AD. I think the ending of Acts favors a dating of 62 AD. Now, more than likely, whoever wrote the book of Acts also wrote the book of Luke, and we can know that due to the shared address to Theophilus. And the Gospel of Luke most likely predates the book of Acts, and the book of Luke most likely predates the book of Acts because the author in the book of Acts mentions a previous work he wrote to Theophilus, making Luke the most likely candidate. So this would be very simple evidence for a pre-70 AD dating. Now, there's more discussion to be had here, but for the sake of the video, let's move on.
There is no 1st century manuscript.
This is also true, but I don't think this helps Jeff's case here. Not having a 1st century manuscript is not at all surprising on the condition the Gospels were in prior to 70 AD. I mean, our earliest intact data that we have is the Codex Sinaiticus, and that dates to the 4th century. Everything in the 2nd century is just mere fragments. Are we really going to act super surprised that 50 to 100 years of extra wear and tear are going to make it virtually impossible to find 1st century fragments on the condition that they were circulating around that time? So this lack of data in the 1st century is intelligible on both conditions, whether it's pre or post 70 AD, making it a moot point to bring up. It's not evidence for or against my theory or his theory.
There is no citation or quotation of any of the Gospels anywhere in the entire 1st century.
Notice Jeff hasn't even presented evidence yet. He's just kind of pointing to silence constantly and going, evidence, when really arguments from silence suck, and you'll see that as a continual theme throughout this video. Nonetheless, it seems like Jeff is forgetting about this guy named Paul who actually quotes from the Gospels, who died 62 AD, meaning that whoever he's quoting had to have been around before 62 AD. For example, take 1 Corinthians 11:23. You see Paul quoting Jesus from the Last Supper. The Synoptic Gospels all record this saying of Jesus from the Last Supper. Or another one, 1 Timothy 5:17-18. You'll see this Old Testament reference, you shall not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain, but then you see another one, the laborer deserves to be paid. But in this verse, Paul is claiming to be quoting scripture. You shall not muzzle an ox is in Deuteronomy, but what about the laborer deserves to be paid? That's not in the Old Testament, it's not in the Septuagint, there's no Jewish writings that contain this, but what we do have is Luke 10:7. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. And there's more. For example, some scholars think the Didache quotes the Gospel of Matthew, and that dates to about 90 AD. Back to Jeff.
So in order to date the Gospels prior to 70 CE, you have to assume a miraculous divine intervention by God to speak to a prophet to predict the future when there is absolutely no evidence that these things existed in the early 1st century.
So far, this has been Jeff's argument. I don't see any evidence for pre-70 AD dating, therefore they were probably written post-70 AD. But he's making a somewhat probative point here. Unfortunately for him, this point falls apart again when you just look at some basic history. He says that Jesus of Nazareth could not have predicted the destruction of the temple because that's prophecy and that's supernatural and that's a big no-no when you do history. Let's just put aside the question begging for naturalism and all that stuff here. Let's just grant this methodology. Consider the case of Jesus ben Ananias. Josephus, a respected Roman Jewish historian, writes about this man who, before 70 AD, went around Jerusalem predicting the city's destruction. He shouted, "Woe to Jerusalem," for years until he was killed during the siege, after seeing his warnings come true. So if Jesus ben Ananias could predict the destruction of the temple in the Jewish war, why could Jesus of Nazareth not predict the destruction? Now, Jeff might push back and say something like, well, Josephus was written post-70 AD. But what matters here is not when Josephus is writing. What matters here is that he's documenting an individual who, before 70 AD, did in fact predict a Jewish war and the destruction of the temple. The fact that the temple had been destroyed before makes it plausible that someone could anticipate it happening again. Additionally, Jesus could have been alluding to Daniel, for instance. Additionally, Josephus places these events under Governor Lucius Albinus, who governed between 62 and 64 AD, years before 70 AD. So I can explain this naturalistically without invoking the supernatural at all. Jesus of Nazareth could have seen the rising tensions between the Jews and the Romans, could have predicted the destruction of the temple in a Jewish war because of that, and could have thought, for instance, that that would have happened because of Daniel 7 and because it's happened before. Nothing supernatural here. In other words, the prediction of the destruction of the temple is intelligible on both the condition that the Gospels were in pre-70 AD and post-70 AD, making this a non-probative point. It's not evidence for my theory or Jeff's theory.
When the scholars decide to quit pacifying Christians, they will admit that there's no evidence that the Gospels were written in the first century.
If you're buying into this theory that all these scholars are pacifying Christians, despite the fact that they're actively arguing against Orthodox Christian belief, I can't help you. This is the type of propagandizing that cult leaders do.
All the evidence for Christianity appears in the 2nd century or later.
And as we've briefly shown in this video, it doesn't.
Question 2. Why do we think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? First of all, the text of these books never identify an author at all.
This is true. The Gospels are internally anonymous, but it's a mistake to infer from there that they're strictly anonymous. Internal anonymity being something like the Gospels, for instance, where the author doesn't name themselves and doesn't use first-person language. If the Gospels were strictly anonymous, we would be saying something like they were circulated without any names attached to them in the beginning. But internal anonymity does not entail strict anonymity. So let's see what inferences he makes from here.
The author of Luke admits that he's not an eyewitness, but he is just writing down what many people have written down before him.
Hold on, let's look at the text. Notice Luke's wording and intentional positioning in proximity to his sources. He's using language like accomplished among us and refers to eyewitnesses delivering accounts to us. He's using first-person plural pronouns, indicating he has an informed familiarity with the events. So what was he an eyewitness to? We don't really know for sure, but he is claiming to be an eyewitness. For instance, he makes a demarcation between himself and the early eyewitnesses. So why would Luke make a distinction between himself and the early eyewitnesses if he was not claiming to be an eyewitness? The temporal demarcation, in conjunction with the first-person language, implies that Luke is calling himself an eyewitness. In other words, he's considering himself a later eyewitness, not an early eyewitness.
And he is writing to a man named Theophilus, a most excellent Theophilus, but yet we don't know who this guy is or when he lived. And that's highly suspicious. I presented a lot of evidence in my book, Jesus Demigod, that this Theophilus was Theophilus of Antioch in the late 2nd century.
So I got his book. Let me pull up a quote from his book for you. If you're looking at this quote and wondering where's the evidence, ironically, he's offering none, but the fact that he believes this and that this can explain the alleged contradictions in the Gospels, which, by the way, if traditional authorship is true, we can explain the contradictions as well, even if we granted contradictions. So that's not really helping him. And he says it can explain why Luke was Irenaeus' favorite gospel. But hold on. That contradicts something he says earlier in his book when he says this. I'm going to pull a skeptic here. Is it Irenaeus' favorite book because this is where Irenaeus learned the most about the life of Jesus? Or is it Irenaeus' favorite book because it was addressed to Theophilus of Antioch? Using the same logic of the skeptic, could it be possible that the author of this book isn't Jeff for Truth? That would also explain why there's contradictions in the book like this. Now, before somebody says that this isn't a true contradiction and you can harmonize this idea and yada yada yada, that's the whole point! Because later on, Jeff is going to throw a hissy fit about contradictions in the Bible and how you can't harmonize them. But why is it that it's okay to harmonize this?
In the Gospel of Matthew, the author says that Jesus walked by a tax collector named Matthew, and he told him to follow him, and he followed him. Not I followed him.
Now Jeff is insinuating that Matthew's use of third-person language implies that the Gospel of Matthew is not written by Matthew, because why would you, as the author, use third-person language instead of first-person language? Would anybody in history ever do that? The answer is yes, they do. For instance, take this book by William Lawrence Shirer, who witnessed the events of World War II. But guess what? You never see him use first-person language in his book and refer to himself in this book. And in fact, he uses other sources to write his history. Based off all that, surely he's not an eyewitness to the events of World War II, right? See how that logic falls apart? Furthermore, I actually think that this use of third-person language and removal of Matthew in the Gospel of Matthew helps our case for Matthean authorship. I won't read this whole quote, but in light of what Armin D. Baum says, Jeff's argument misunderstands the literary context in which the Gospel of Matthew was written. The use of third person and anonymity aligns with ancient Jewish and Near Eastern historiographical conventions, where the authors intentionally obscured their identities to focus the reader's attention on the subject matter rather than themselves. So Matthew's use of the third-person singular he is not evidence against Matthean authorship, but is actually expected on the condition that Matthew, a Jewish tax collector, wrote the Gospel of Matthew, reflecting a Jewish stylistic framework. So while Jeff presents evidence this time, it doesn't help him, it helps the traditional authorship advocate.
And that brings up another interesting data point. There is not a single story anywhere in any of the four Gospels where any of the authors ever said that they did something or they saw something themselves. Everything is written in the third person. It says he did this and they did that. It never says I did this or I did that.
And for the reasons stated earlier, this isn't a problem for me. But just to really solidify my point, here is a list of other ancient authors that don't use first-person language in some of their works. This was a common practice even in historiography in place and time. So this is not a disconfirmation of traditional authorship. It just shows that Jeff doesn't know what he's talking about.
So why do they call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? It's because of Irenaeus in the late 2nd century who attributed these names to four Gospels. But yet the Gospels he referred to is not even the Gospels that we have today, because he said that Matthew wrote a Gospel in the Hebrew tongue. We do not have that. That is not the Matthew that we have today.
Did you catch that? He just made a claim with no evidence. Why should we suppose Irenaeus attributed the names later on? I could say a whole lot on the Matthew Hebrew tongue thing, but let's just put that aside from now. Let's just say he's completely right. So what? He's pointing to a data point, but not making any inferences about why we should think that this helps his case. He just looks at the data, says it supports his theory, without making any sort of inferential bridge between his data point and the conclusion. Jeff, you need to make inferences.
Question 3. Why don't we consider the Gospels to be an accurate historical primary source record? When the Gospels mention historical events, they are not corroborated by anybody.
To say that there's no outside corroboration of events in the Gospels is just ridiculous. See this video for just one instance.
For example, when Herod unalived babies 2 years old and under at the time of Jesus' birth, that is not a historical record. It is not corroborated by anybody. People wrote about the events of Herod's reign, but he didn't talk about this.
Another argument from silence. What a surprise. Arguments from silence really suck, and if you really want to know why, see Dr. Tim McGrew's paper, The Argument from Silence. In short, our intuitions about what an author would or wouldn't write about in history is really bad. Here's just a few examples of silence in history that we may intuitively expect the authors to write about. Now, Jeff is talking about a widespread silence here, but the issue is that we have no reason to expect anyone to write about this besides maybe Josephus, since he had a work titled The Life of Herod. Other than that, I'm not sure why we'd expect anybody to write about this event. And since Josephus is the only one we might expect him to write about, here's a list of other things he doesn't talk about. He doesn't mention the expulsion of the Jews from Rome by Emperor Claudius. Suetonius, a 2nd century Roman historian, does, and Luke also talks about it in Acts 18:2. Rather shockingly, Josephus is silent about it. But that doesn't lead historians to think it doesn't happen. So why would Josephus be silent on this topic? We can only give speculations. Bethlehem wasn't a booming metropolis, and neither was the surrounding area. We're talking a population of tops 12 to 1500. The massacre of the innocents, as horrible as it was, resulted in the deaths of maybe a dozen babies. To us, that sounds horrible. But to a Roman audience, that would have seemed like no big deal, where infanticide was a norm.
Luke says that Jesus was born 10 to 15 years after Matthew says he was born, but Luke associates his birth with the census of Quirinius. When Matthew and Luke give different years of the birth of Jesus, you cannot accept these books as reliable historical records when they disagree with each other and they disagree with actual unbiased history.
I'm not going to deal with every single contradiction that he spouts off here. Many scholars have already put up harmonizations for these accounts. But let's just say Luke or Matthew made a good faith error in reporting the birth of Jesus. My question now is, so what? How do you make an inference from one good faith error to the totality of the Gospels is unreliable and there's no historical kernel of truth at all within the Gospels? If this is how we did history, we'd be back in the Dark Ages.
I could go on and on with contradictions within the Gospels. So it is indisputable that the Gospels cannot be considered a reliable historical record because they can't even agree with each other.
And again, I could go on explaining why none of these are contradictions, but that would make this video longer than it already is. So instead, just check out all of these resources for answers to all of these contradictions.
So any notion that the Bible or any part of it is the inspired and infallible Word of God is a completely baseless claim that is based on nothing but blind faith.
And we're full circle with the faith thing again. Nonetheless, I never said anything about inspiration or inerrancy or infallibility in my post. So, slight goalpost shift there, and you've provided no evidence that that is the case.